Hi, this is Dr. McGrath, and I'm here to do a review video for you. This is review video 1, preparing you for your early music exam number 3. Okay, so please take out your review sheet and look at question number 1. And I'm going to suggest that you try to answer these questions. I'm going to ask them. If you can answer them, that means you probably got this down. If you can't, then write it down and make sure that you are prepared to answer it quickly. That means that you'll have the information cold if you can answer it really quickly. Okay, so the first question asks about the period of years that represents the Baroque era. And that period of years is 1600 to 1750. And remember, 1750 represents the year that Bach died. It's also the year that Bach died, so it's just a useful little trick to help to remember the end of the Baroque era. The late Baroque era is generally considered to begin around 1700 to 1750. The two most important late Baroque era composers are someone we've been talking about recently, J.S. Bach, and also George Friedrich Handel. Now, unfortunately, we didn't get much of a chance to talk about Handel, so I'm going to do a little extra review later on when we start getting to the questions directly about Handel. Okay, the next question is, what Baroque important period instrument has been revived in this century? And the answer to that is the instrument that we watched on YouTube, which was, we watched a Frescobaldi piece being performed on this beautiful instrument. It's a keyboard instrument, and it is called the harpsichord. Harpsichord is the answer to that. And that's been revived in this century, thankfully, because it's such a beautiful sounding instrument. Remember, too, it's also a continuo instrument, and that's going to be a question later on in the exam. Okay, the next question is, what would historians call the Baroque period? What would historians, that's the important part of that question. Historians call the Baroque period the age of absolutism. Now, what does that mean? That means that Baroque monarchs, the aristocracy, especially the monarchs, the kings, they were considered to have absolute power. And the ruler that really represents that best is Louis XIV, who was a French king. And I want you to remember, too, that Louis's court was pretty extravagant, and he had great support for music. In fact, he was a musician himself. Okay, which best describes the dualism found in Baroque art and music? Remember, dualism means that we have two sides. In one side, we have pomp and extravagance. On the other side, we have systematic calculation, or system and calculation. Remember, we've talked about that a lot in class. We looked at representatives of that in architecture, in art, and also in music. Who was the leading monarch in the age of absolutism? Oh my gosh, I already went over that one. Who is it? Louis XIV, you've got it. He was otherwise known as the Sun King. He was very interested in the arts and participated in the arts. The extravagance of his court was known throughout Europe, and he became really a model for a lot of other courts in Europe. The next question, well, two of them kind of go together. What was the purpose of art in the age of absolutism? And which is true of music in the age of absolutism? Well, there are many purposes for art and for music, but one of them was, at least partly, to flatter the nobility who paid for it. Remember, these nobles, they were showing how extravagant and how learned they were, and they had a lot of funding for the arts. Art glorified the rulers of the era. It was meant to impress and to overwhelm. That's what you need to know for the exam. Okay, the next question asks about opera. Around what year did opera basically start? And your book indicates that that was around 1600. So remember that. 1600 is a nice even number. It's easy to remember. What characteristic of Baroque theater made it appealing to Baroque audiences and composers of opera? What made it appealing? The display of strong emotions, that's one of the things. It's theatricality. Opera was a perfect fit, and remember too, opera houses were new in this era, because opera was new, and that gave audiences something That gave them a little bit of power. It wasn't just about the nobility anymore, even though the nobility were often very involved still with operas and supported operas, especially those that glorified the monarchy. However, the general public was also very involved in going to opera houses and watching the drama unfold. The next question is, which best describes rhythm in the Baroque era? Think about this. You know the answer. It's completely different. It's changed a lot from the Middle Ages, that's for sure. By the Baroque era, rhythm had become more regular than what we found in the Renaissance, and there's now a much more clear sense of meter. Oftentimes whole pieces are clearly in a particular meter, and dances from our dance suites were often defined by the meter and the tempo. The next question, which best describes the musical depiction of emotion in the late Baroque era? Again, we find a clear dualism of the age in the display of emotion, as well as we do in just generally in music. While there are deep emotions displayed, these emotions were categorized, and musical expression of emotion was a systemized, I can't read my own, I can't tell what I said. It was systemized into techniques and devices. Okay, so we have a systematic exploration of emotion. We have clear categories and specific techniques and musical devices that are used to express those particular emotions. I think the example we used in class was sadness. So sadness was often portrayed in a very specific way with certain types of motives, like sigh motives, with descending lines, with very slow music. So you do have the display of deep emotion, but it's not the emotion of the composer. It's a systematized view of emotion, and certain musical techniques are used, specific techniques are used to describe those categories of emotion. Got it? I know it's a little bit more complicated, so you might want to rewind and play that back. Okay, what else do we have here? Next is, the next question. Baroque composers were likely to think of themselves as craftsmen. So remember, they were usually employed by a monarch, or they were employed by a church, or they were working for opera houses as well. And they were craftsmen. They were expected to provide on demand. So if someone asked for example, Bach was asked for a cantata every week, he would have to provide a cantata every week. That was his job. And that's much different than the romantic ideals that will happen after the classical era. So we've got right now the Baroque, then we have the classical, then we have the Romantic era. The Romantic era, everything changes. And our conception of an artist as a genius, as this person who's expressing their innermost emotions, that's something that originated in the Romantic era, definitely not in the Baroque era. So again, Baroque era composers are craftsmen or craftswomen. Okay, I'll do one more question on a review sheet, and that is, what were the three main institutions where Baroque composers could make a living? You know the answer to this. Two of them are the same as in the Renaissance. We have the church, we have the courts, and the new place, the opera house. You've got it. Okay, that will conclude the first review video. We've covered a good portion of the review sheet, and video 2 will cover the next portion.